Have you ever wondered why some people seem capable of thinking on an entirely different level? Not because they know more facts, not because they have better memories, but because they can cut through confusion, identify what matters, and arrive at conclusions that seem almost inevitable. The historical Albert Einstein was one of those people. And according to Einstein himself, one of the most important influences on his intellectual development wasn't a physics book, it wasn't a university, and it certainly wasn't consuming information passively. It was a geometry textbook written more than 2,300 years ago, a book that Einstein later described as a holy little geometry book. That book was Euclid's Elements. Now, that may not sound particularly exciting. After all, most people hear the word geometry and immediately think back to school, triangles, angles, theorems. But here's the fascinating thing. This single book influenced Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Hobbes, Bertrand Russell, Albert Einstein, and countless other extraordinary thinkers. In fact, if influence is any measure, Euclid's Elements may have helped produce more great minds than any university in history. The question is why? What was hidden inside this ancient book that had such a profound effect on so many remarkable people? And more importantly, what can it teach us about how exceptional thinking is actually developed? Let's begin with Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln had very little formal education. In total, he spent less than a year in school. Yet he would eventually become one of the most influential political leaders in history. Early in his legal career, however, Lincoln faced a problem. He was losing arguments that he felt he should have been winning. Not because the facts were against him, but because he realized he didn't truly understand what it meant to prove something. He later wrote that nobody could become a competent lawyer without understanding what the word demonstrate really meant. So what did he do? He turned to Euclid. And he became so committed to understanding the book that he reportedly memorized large portions of it before returning to his legal practice. Now here's the interesting question. Why would a future president study geometry to become a better lawyer? The answer lies in the very first thing Euclid teaches. Before proving anything, Euclid defines his terms. What is a point? What is a line? What is a straight line? Only after defining his terms does he begin building conclusions. This may seem obvious, but think about how many arguments occur because people are using the same words differently. What exactly is success? What exactly is intelligence? What exactly is freedom? People often disagree, not because they hold different conclusions, but because they're operating from different definitions. Euclid understood something profound. Clarity begins with definitions. Lincoln learned that lesson, and it transformed the way he argued. But defining terms was only the beginning. Our next thinker discovered something even more powerful. Thomas Hobbes encountered Euclid later in life. Unlike Lincoln, he was already highly educated. Then one day he came across a proof in Euclid. His initial reaction was simple. This can't be right. So he worked backwards through the reasoning. One step, then another, following the chain all the way back to the foundations. And eventually he reached a startling realization. The conclusion wasn't merely persuasive, it was unavoidable. Given the assumptions, it had to be true. This experience changed Hobbes profoundly, and it introduced him to one of Euclid's most powerful tools. When you can't prove something directly, assume the opposite. Then follow the consequences. If the opposite eventually leads to contradiction, your original conclusion becomes much stronger. This is an incredibly powerful habit. Suppose you believe you'll never build a successful business. Instead of defending that belief, assume the opposite. Suppose you could. What would have to be true? What skills would need to improve? What systems would need to exist? What evidence supports that possibility? Suddenly, you're exploring instead of defending, learning instead of merely believing, and that shift changes everything. A quick thought before we continue. Whatever subject or skill you're exploring, one of the most valuable investments you can make is improving the way you think and the way you learn. That's why we've created a free quantum learning series exploring clearer thinking, more effective learning, and stronger cognitive habits. If you'd like to explore those ideas, you'll find the link below. Now, let's continue. But if Hobbes learned the power of contradiction, Einstein learned something different. Einstein wasn't fascinated by any particular theorem. What fascinated him was the structure itself. He saw a system that began with a handful of assumptions and carefully built an entire intellectual structure from them. Nothing was arbitrary. Nothing was simply asserted. Everything connected. Everything rested on foundations. Years later, Einstein would use a remarkably similar approach when developing his own theories. Start with clear assumptions. Build carefully. Follow the implications wherever they lead. This reveals another principle hidden inside Euclid. Complex ideas are built from simple foundations. Most people try to solve difficult problems all at once. Great thinkers often work differently. They break problems into smaller components. They identify dependencies. They solve the foundations first. Then they build upward. Like constructing a cathedral, one stone at a time. And finally we arrive at Bertrand Russell. Russell's insight may be the most important of all. When he first encountered Euclid, he was frustrated. He didn't like the fact that Euclid began with assumptions. He wanted everything to be proven. Everything. But eventually Russell realized something profound. The strength of the system wasn't that it lacked assumptions. The strength was that the assumptions were visible, explicit, honest, declared in plain sight. Most arguments fail because assumptions remain hidden. Sometimes even the person making the argument doesn't know they're making them. And hidden assumptions are dangerous because they can't be examined, they can't be challenged, they can't be improved. Imagine someone says, "University is the best path to success." That sounds like a conclusion, but underneath it sit assumptions. Assumptions about education, assumptions about income, assumptions about opportunity, assumptions about the future. Once those assumptions become visible, real thinking can begin. And this brings us to the deeper lesson hidden beneath all four stories. Because I don't think Euclid's true contribution was geometry. In fact, I don't think geometry was the point at all. Lincoln didn't become great because he learned about triangles and theorems. Neither did Hobbes, Einstein, or Russell. What Euclid gave them was something far more valuable. A way of interacting with knowledge itself. Think about what Euclid forces you to do. Define your terms. Identify your assumptions. Justify your conclusions. Search for contradictions. Break complex problems into simpler ones. Move between details and the larger structure. At first glance, these appear to be reasoning techniques, but something deeper is happening. Each of these activities forces active engagement. You aren't merely receiving information, you're questioning it, organizing it, testing it, connecting it, restructuring it, looking at it from multiple perspectives, moving between the details and the big picture. And as you do that, something remarkable happens. The subject stops being information and starts becoming understanding. And that understanding doesn't remain trapped inside your own mind. It begins to improve the way you communicate as well. Because communication is, in many ways, the outward expression of how clearly you understand. The clearer your definitions become, then the clearer your explanations become. The more aware you are of your assumptions, the easier it becomes to discuss complex ideas with other people. The more coherent your thinking becomes, the more coherent your writing becomes, your teaching, your leadership, your decision making. This is one reason so many extraordinary thinkers were also extraordinary communicators. They weren't merely expressing ideas more effectively, they were building those ideas more effectively in the first place. And when you learn to build ideas clearly, communicating them becomes far easier. This is one of the central ideas behind the quantum learning program. Most people believe learning happens when information enters the mind. But deep learning happens when the mind actively constructs understanding. The more deeply you engage with an idea, the more connections you create. The more connections you create, the more coherent your mental model becomes. The more coherent that mental model becomes, the more useful, flexible, and durable your knowledge becomes. This is why two people can read the same book and emerge with completely different levels of understanding. The difference isn't simply the information they encountered. The difference is how actively they interacted with it. And perhaps that's why Euclid's Elements influenced so many extraordinary thinkers. Not because it gave them answers, but because it forced them to participate in the construction of understanding itself. If we step back and look at everything we've discussed, a remarkable pattern emerges. The same 6 principles appear again and again. Define your terms, state your assumptions, construct rather than assert, justify your reasoning, break complex problems into simpler ones, and when necessary, examine the opposite possibility and follow it wherever it leads. These aren't merely techniques, they're habits, and habits of thought eventually become habits of life. The quality of your decisions depends upon the quality of your thinking, and the quality of your thinking depends upon how you engage with ideas. Don't just consume them, interact with them, question them, challenge them, build them. Because the people who learn how to do that gain one of the greatest advantages available in life. They stop collecting information and start constructing understanding. If you'd like to go deeper into these ideas, you'll find the free Quantum Learning series linked below. And if you think Euclid's ideas are powerful, wait until you discover why some language learners become fluent from a single book, while others struggle for years. That's where we'll go next.